Hey, how's everybody doing? Hope you're having a fantastic day. So, this episode of our series on De Revelatione is going to be slightly different. And there might actually be a lot of you who are watching this episode that ordinarily wouldn't watch the other episodes, which, you should watch the other episodes because I think this is a very helpful series on fundamental theology. But in this episode, we're basically going to be going over some objections which are given by the pantheistic evolutionists. I know I'm kind of out of order, which is why this is 12.5, which I'm releasing after episode 13, but it is what it is. And the reason that I originally thought that I wouldn't cover all of these objections given by pantheistic evolutionists, emanationists, whatever, and then ended up deciding that I would is because the sort of sheer lack of resources when it comes to correctly describing and defending the Thomistic view of creation and of the immobility of God and of divine actuality and then things like that is these are almost never adequately defended, and it often leaves kind of an embarrassing gap that a lot of Thomists cannot fill. So I thought that this would be helpful to go over some of the objections and answers that are given by Garrigou in the end of chapter. Let me see if I can remember the chapter number. Chapter 8. That's kind of weird. I don't go off the chapter number. I go off the episode number. But yes, chapter 8, article 2, part 3 are various different objections and answers. So if you want something that's a little bit perhaps deeper, that is in more technical terminology and so on, then you can just reference the original text if you want to. Before we begin, as a reminder, and this is this time I have a greater motive of, it wouldn't be a motive of credibility, but it would be a motive of action for this, since I had to go through the torturous process of changing basically this very sort of succinct and technical language of scholastic answers and responses. I had to change that into something that is, applicable for a video format. So because of that, I would very much appreciate if you would either directly donate at christianbwagner.com/donate as a thank you, or become a patron at patreon.com/militantthomist. Okay, so what is the first objection? This first objection is basically going to lay the groundwork for a lot of the objections that are going to be brought up by the basically evolutionists of all sorts. By evolutionists, remember, I don't mean, thinking that some species come from other species. I don't mean that, but by evolutionism, we're talking about the relationship of God to the world. So if you don't know about that and would like to know more about that, you can look at episode 12 of the De Revelatione series to find out more about what this whole evolutionism thing is. Pantheistic evolutionism is a part of it, which can either be material or idealistic. There's also emanationism, and there's a bunch of different, forms of this. But the main argument is basically going to be this. And weirdly enough, what's very interesting is that you hear this a lot from, contemporary anti-classical theists of all sorts, everything from, whatever's that cringe analytic philosopher is doing down the street, to whatever Jay Dyer is talking about. It's very common objections that are basically stolen from these pantheistic evolutionists. So the first argument is going to be like this. By the force of the principle of causality, the more cannot be produced from the less. So this is something which we're going to concede. True, the more cannot be produced from the less. Now there is, in fact, more in motion than in immobility. Therefore, motion cannot be produced by an immobile being, but instead exists from himself and is the principle of all things. But not him, but it, like being, exists of itself and is the principle of all things. So this is an interesting objection that goes on right here. I actually heard Doug Wilson. If any of you know Doug Wilson, he is a how do I put it? A quasi-reformed figure who is against St. Thomas, And he basically brought up this objection as, wasn't St. Thomas so silly because he thought that God was immobile, kind of like some big old ice cube up in the sky who couldn't move or do anything. But what this objection misses is that when we say immobile, we can actually mean two things by immobile. First is what the theologians are going to talk about as privative immobility. And that basically means that due to something's potency or imperfection, that in order to have perfection, one needs to move. So this is the immobility of a terminus a quo, that is a terminus from which. So, for example, by mobility, we just mean any sort of change from imperfection to perfection. But when it comes to the immobility, let's say, of a sort of child towards adulthood, that would be an imperfection because the child needs to grow up to the perfection of being a human being. So this mobility from potentially being an adult to actually being an adult, that's a good thing. And to be immobile, that is to sort of stay a child, that's a bad thing. Now, on the other hand, we can not speak of privative immobility, but we can also speak of negative immobility. And negative immobility is something different. Negative immobility basically means you already have it. So you already have the perfection that you need. You already have the actuality that you need. So you don't actually need to go outside of yourself to get any of this perfection. You already have the perfection in yourself. So we could speak on the one hand of a stunted child as having immobility towards adulthood. And on the other hand, we could speak of a mature adult as having immobility towards adulthood. The former, because they're not moving towards adulthood. The latter, because they're already there. So when we talk about the immobility of God, what we mean by the immobility is that he already has the perfections that he needs and that he doesn't need to change to be more perfect. And this is really the difference between what we're going to kind of call this sort of stunted inertia on the one hand, something that resists a sort of perfection, on the other hand, stability. Because stability and constancy are things which are perfections. So we can think of kind of this in a threefold way. On the one hand, you have the sort of imperfect inertia of something that won't change for the better. And on the other hand, you have mobility that's kind of in a process of flux, in a process of change. And this is a good thing, as long as it's kind of a generation and not a destruction. It's moving towards the good rather than towards the evil. But then on the third case, you have a third category that these guys often leave out. And this is the sort of immobility of a sort of stability. So it's kind of like the sort of immobility, Garrigou, in his sort of traditional fashion of comparing theological and philosophical concepts to spiritual concepts. He basically says that the immobility of spiritual contemplation is better than the sort of roaming activity of imagination. So what this means by is you can kind of compare this to, let's say, somebody who has just started mental prayer. And that person who's just started mental prayer is going to kind of roam from thing to thing. He's going to be all moving around in his thoughts, in his affections. They're going to be moving and changing and trying to push forward through all of these discrete acts towards perfection. And this is natural. This is very natural. And St. Ignatius is really a master of this anyways. But on the other hand, you can think of the sort of mystical contemplation of a St. John of the Cross or of a blessed Denis the Carthusian. Blessed Denis the Carthusian would have ecstasies that would last 8 or 9 hours. And these ecstasies would basically be an immobility towards one thought. It kind of if anybody's experienced this in prayer, it kind of happens when something catches you. You know, you have a sort of concept or idea that catches you, and then you're fixed to that point. Being fixed to that point, that's a perfection. It's perfection. So this argument runs off of a fallacy, and it's an equivocation in the minor premise. The minor premise is there is, in fact, more in motion than in immobility. If you mean an immobility of constancy or sort of perfective immobility, then no, there's actually less in motion than there is in immobility. Mobility then is a certain imperfection. But on the other hand, if you mean to compare the immobile, the sort of privative immobility, then actually there is more in motion than the other. So we would here distinguish the minor premise. Now we're skipping forward to the third objection. And this is the third objection, which kind of attempts to, continue disputing now from a different point, now that we've said this about immobility in God. This next objection is basically that to posit this immobility would actually be to somehow deny the reality of creation itself. It's the proof that they bring forward for this is that when the first mover begins to move, there is then more him than before. Now the first mover does indeed begin to move. Otherwise, he would act in the same manner from eternity, meaning that there would be no new effect in the world. Therefore, there is more found in the activity of the first mover than in his immobility. So they would say, well, if you're going to say that he's purely immobile in an active sense, then you're going to have to say that creation doesn't work, because creation is going to somehow require God to begin acting as he hadn't acted before. And therefore, we're going to need to say that God is somehow becoming and, fall into their web of pantheistic evolutionism. So the way that the Thomists are going to respond to this is they're going to make a distinction. They're going to say that there's no newness of action in the first mover. They're going to say the divinity is in act from eternity. And then somebody may say, well, in this case, is there going to be a sort of eternal creation that occurs? Well, that's not the case, because while we concede that there is no newness of action in the first mover, we don't concede that there is not a newness of effect. So we distinguish between the newness of action, which is from eternity, and the newness of effect, which is brought about in time. And to illustrate this, we can bring forward a text from Summa Contra Gentiles, Book 2. Here, St. Thomas says, the newness of the divine effect does not demonstrate the newness of an action in God, since his action is his essence, as we showed above in Book 1, Chapter 45. So here's where we make kind of a famous distinction between an act which is formally immanent and then that same act which is virtually transient. So what does formally immanent mean? So formally immanent means that the act is itself as an act within oneself. So a formally immanent act would, for example, be in us an act of the will. Purely an act of the will without, deciding to move and act outside of ourselves. That is a formally immanent act. So we say that when it comes to the act to creation, that's something which is formally immanent. It is an act within God that is from eternity. And therefore, it's something which is really identical to the divine essence. But we would say, on the other hand, not only is it formally immanent, but it's also virtually transient. So virtually transient means it has the sort of power as an internal act to posit something externally that depends on it. And what we kind of have to understand at this point, when it comes to this formally immanent and virtually transient act, which is kind of analogous to, let's say, me willing within myself to 10 minutes from now get up out of my chair and make myself a cup of coffee. I'm positing at once a formally immanent act happening now, and another time I'm positing an effect to happen 10 minutes later. And of course, this is an imperfect analogy because there's going to be a formally transient act that I have to occur of, getting up and walking across the room 10 minutes from now. But nevertheless, it illustrates as an internal act what this means. So we have to understand at this point is that, yes, this kind of breaks your brain to think about. But on the other hand, when it comes to these certain mysteries of the divinity, that we don't need to sort of have a positive resolution in our brains when it comes to this. It doesn't have to make sense to us. And this is the error of a lot of the modern, especially analytic philosophy nerds, if you want to put it like that. is they are too concerned with the resolution of their principles and it making sense to them, which frequently brings them into error. But when it comes to the thought of St. Thomas, he works from most certain principles to most certain conclusions and shows merely, this is all we have to show merely that this is not repugnant to reason. So to have a formally immanent and virtually transient act, which posits a newness of effect without sort of positing a newness of activity, that, while it's difficult to conceive of, is not repugnant to reason. So our position still stands and is not refuted. That's very, very important right here, is that this is going to take a lot of stretching of your brain to try to think about. We have to realize that you only have to recognize that it's not contradictory. And the same goes for things like predestination, free will, also the Trinity and unity of God, also the incarnation and things of this nature. At this point, somebody might bring forward another objection that's slightly different, and this is numbered as by Garrigou as the fourth objection. This objection is basically, well, what you say that sounds fine and all, but when you posit a cause, then you simultaneously posit the effect. So you're either going to have to say that there's a newness of cause, which brings about a newness of effect, or you're going to have to say that there isn't a newness of action, and that creation is somehow from eternity, which we know isn't true. But what we have to see in this is we have to see that this is actually fallacious reasoning, because we make a distinction between something which is a sort of immediate and necessary cause of something. So you can think of, like, if you have a ball and the ball hits another ball, then that action of the ball hitting the other ball is going to immediately bring about the effect. So there's a distinction between that, which are somehow necessary causes, and then a free cause. Because a free cause, as we saw, we can participate somehow, not obviously in its full sense, but we can somehow participate in this type of distinction between the sort of positing of an action and the carrying out of that action, or the bringing about of the effect. Now, of course, due to our limited participation in eternity, this looks slightly different. But when it comes to God, not only is he a free cause, which doesn't have any sort of necessary relation to the effect, and therefore can posit the effect as existing whenever he wants, but he's also one that exists above and beyond time, so sort of isn't limited in that way. And St. Thomas is going to explain how in SCG 2, chapter 35. And he says, just as the doing of a thing is determined through the intellect and all of its conditions, so too does it prescribe its time. For art does not only determine that something should be such and such, but also so that it be at a given time, as the doctor determines that medicine is to be given at a given time. Whence, if his willing were of itself efficacious for producing the effect would follow anew from his previous willing, with no new action being needed on his part. Therefore, nothing prevents us from saying that God's action existed from eternity, even though the effect of this action is not eternal, but instead comes into existence at the time ordained by him from eternity. God simultaneously brought both creation and time into being. After this, they kind of take a little bit of a different direction with this whole idea of, the more cannot be produced from the less. And they argue that, in our view, because there are various things created outside of God, remember the pantheistic evolutionists and the emanationists don't think that there's more created outside of God. They think everything is sort of within is God. But from this, they're going to take this objection. And it's going to be as follows. When an effect is posited outside of the cause, there's more being than there was before. Now, through creation, created things are posited outside of the first cause. Therefore, after creation, there would be more being than before. Hence, the more would be produced from the less. So it basically said, well, we have God, and then we have creation. So God plus creation equals more, and the more cannot be produced from the less. So here we have to make another distinction. And this distinction is going to be the difference between something which is extensive and something which is intensive. So we would concede that there is more being extensively speaking. So if you want to put it like this, there's more beings but we would deny that there is more being intensively speaking. That is more being. So we're talking about the more not being produced from the less. We're not talking about more beings. We're talking about more being, or else we'd have to deny all change whatsoever. So really here what we're saying is that there's not more perfection, there's not more intensive being, but rather there's only a greater extension, there's only a greater participation. Because when we think about God as the first cause of all creation, God has all of the perfections of creatures in a supremely simple and eminent manner. If you want to know more about this, I did a video, I think it's called Thomistic Divine Simplicity in 20 minutes. I think it explains this point well. But basically, all of the perfections of all of creation exist in a supremely simple and eminent manner in God. So all of the perfections that we receive as creatures isn't going to make more perfection. Rather, it's just going to be a finite participation or extension, if you may, of the perfection that God already has. And I guess I'll give an analogy to make this point clear. So if we think about, let's say, a teacher, and the teacher has, let's say, a knowledge of divine simplicity. Let's put it like that. The teacher has a knowledge of divine simplicity, and the teacher teaches it to 5 students. And the 5 students, get 50% of what the teacher, let's say, is teaching. They kind of understand some of it. So at this point, there isn't more known about divine simplicity. There isn't any sort of, sort of intensive increase of knowledge about divine simplicity. There isn't any more of that. But there is an extension of the amount of individuals who know about divine simplicity. So the more isn't produced from the less, in that a greater knowledge of divine simplicity came from a lesser knowledge of divine simplicity. Rather, it's just communicated to more individuals. Get it? Okay, good. But also as a brief caveat, one could not object to the principle that the more is produced from the less, from the fact that somebody could actually discover more about divine simplicity from, let's say, reading the Principles of St. Thomas. And the reason for this is that the conclusions are virtually contained in the premises. So you're actually only virtually increasing. You're not formally increasing. But that is kind of a story for a different day. After this, the objector is going to continue much in the same way. And from this, you're going to kind of come out with a new, error that we have. And basically, they're going to say, well, okay, you say that we cannot have more being intensively speaking. And by that, you mean a more perfect being. But when it comes to the creative action, it's better for God to create than not to create. So the creative action in God is going to somehow make God himself, even if it might not create more perfection in beings, it's going to create more perfection in God himself. God's going to become more perfect after his creation. So the error when it comes to this is the confusion of the way in which our will works with the way in which God's will works, the way that our freedom works with the way that God's freedom works. So our freedom is basically the indifference of potency to many acts. So as we remember, potency is somehow an imperfection, and our wills need to be drawn to some sort of perfection, some sort of object which perfects our wills, and which we need to determine our wills towards. So human freedom is being able to, have the potency to choose between many of these different goods. But when it comes to God, his will is necessarily ordered towards his own goodness. So it has a sort of simplicity and necessity of willing his own goodness. And because divinity itself has completely all good within itself, there's no potency. God is completely ordered to his own self as goodness. So there isn't anything added on when there is some sort of willing of other objects with God, if that makes sense. I know that's probably sounded very confusing, but basically God's will is already terminated in his own goodness, and creatures as lesser goods don't in any way of necessity draw his will, unlike ours, which needs to will some sort of good to perfect ourselves. If we don't will, we're impotency, and that's imperfection. If God doesn't freely will, he's already completely sufficient and satiated in his own goodness. And any created, limited, participated good, which he wills, he has a non-necessary relation to. He's not anyway in potency to those things, since potency somehow denotes an imperfection. So there's a sort of subtle, little sophistic move that goes on with the objector with these things. After this, he deals with specifically objections which are given by the idealistic evolutionists and then the materialistic evolutionists, but those aren't really relevant for the purpose of this video. You can go through and look at those yourself if you wish. But we're skipping now forward to the objections raised by the emanationists. So this would include like certain Neoplatonists and Gnostics, and then even certain figures like Spinoza and Schelling, who revitalized this error and eventually, morphed into their followers, or as I explained last video, or 2 videos ago, if you're watching this live. Last video, I explained sort of relationship between the two. But basically, the emanationists, what they're going to say is they're going to say that God can only produce something outside of himself from himself. Sort of like they give the example of the spider and the web. Is the spider is kind of giving some sort of production of itself from itself. It's something that materially exists in you and then kind of passes on. If anybody's heard of what's called traducianism, it's a theory of the way in which the soul comes from the parents. They basically think the soul of the child is produced or comes forth from that of the parents. That's basically how they think of creation. Is they think of creation as sort of coming forth like heat from a fire, sort of thing, coming forth in that way. So their argument for this is going to be this. So they're going to say God can only produce something outside of himself by emitting something from himself. Now, that which is emitted from God emanates from the divine substance. Therefore, finite things emanate from the divine substance. And what this argument sort of conflates is 2 genera of causes. So first, we have the efficient cause. So the efficient cause is going to be a certain extrinsic, I guess you could say, extrinsic bringing about of some sort of subject, and then final cause is the other extrinsic cause, which is going to be where the efficient cause directs his causality towards, and then formal and material cause are intrinsic causes. But basically, they fail to distinguish between the efficient cause. So creation is from God. That's true. We say it's from God in the sense that he's the efficient cause of creation, which is usually just in language, English language. When we talk about cause, this is what we mean. But he's not the material cause, which emanation, when we think about emanation, basically the material cause in an emanation comes from the efficient cause. That's what makes for an emanation. So in this, they're confusing the something being from God and something being of God. So God being the efficient cause and God being the material cause. So in this case, there's an equivocation which is going on. So another objection that they're going to bring up is basically that when it comes to transitive action, so we already described what transitive action is. Transitive action is sort of positing an effect outside of the subject. So they're going to say that when it comes to transitive action, there's going to be something proceeding from the agent into the effect. They're going to say that that's just what occurs. And they're going to say, since God is the efficient cause of the world, in this transitive action, which is basically efficient causality, in this, there's going to have to be something from God that goes into the world. So what we have to do is we have to distinguish between 2 types of transitive action. So one is a formally transitive action, and this this action is suited to created agents. So basically, the fire is hot and gives heat to the hot thing, gives heat to the iron, let's say. There's something coming out from the agent, into the thing. And on the other hand, a formally immanent yet virtually transitive action, which we already talked about when it comes to God. And this formally immanent but virtually transitive action contains all of the sort of perfections of a formally immanent action, formally transitive action, but without all of the imperfections. So what's important here as well, just kind of besides that point which solves it, is that when it comes to this description of the emanationists, that the when you have an efficient cause, when you have a transitive act, that basically there's something of the cause coming into the effect. This actually isn't true. Rather, the way in which we think of this is that there's a certain passive potency in the effect that is being actualized by the efficient cause. So that thing is potentially in the subject who is being acted upon. It's not some sort of, communication that's going on there. Like if we had a jar of water and then, poured it into another jar of water. So even in, let's say we wanted to say that it's a formally transitive action, even in a formally transitive action, what they say about this just isn't true. Now, from this objection that they're going to bring up a different one. They're going to say, well, okay, you're right that God cannot be the material cause of things, but, and this is actually more in keeping with the mind of the Neoplatonists, but they're going to say, actually, God can be the formal cause of all things. And the way they prove this, they can actually, attempt to prove this from St. Thomas's own works, because he's going to say that God is existence itself. Then existence is the most formal of all things, which St. Thomas says. Therefore, God is the formal cause of all things. So what we have to recognize here is that there's a bit of a equivocation which is going on here. And the equivocation that's going on here is they are not distinguishing between what's called the sort of proper an interior or intrinsic formal cause of something and the extrinsic formal cause of something, which technically the extrinsic formal cause isn't really the formal cause of anything. It's merely just the eminent form of the intrinsic formal cause. So what I mean by this is basically the actual form of something and then the ideal of that form. So we can think of, for example, let me think, the sort of form of man. We can think of the form of man, and then the sort of ideal of the form of man, which actually happens in our Lord Jesus Christ. So I guess this objection doesn't work. I mean, I guess this example doesn't work as well. We can think of the form of a rock. Okay, I think I'm safe with this one. We think of the form of a rock, and there's a bunch of different rocks with this form of the rock, this intrinsic formal cause of the rock. But there's a sort of ideal form of a rock that we could think about as exemplifying rockiness in its sort of perfection. So when it comes to God, God is not the intrinsic formal cause of all things. That's ridiculous. St. Thomas denies it in multiple different ways. But rather, he's the ideal sort of formal cause of things. Created things somehow imitate the different perfections of the divinity, and this can lead to a very profound sort of contemplation when it comes to the relationship between divine naming, simplicity, perfections of things. But unfortunately, I can't really get to that right now. So that we need to make this distinction between these two things. So the intrinsic formal causes participates in some manner as what is posterior in that which is primary, which is the extrinsic formal cause, which ultimately is going to be ipsum esse, or being itself, or existence itself, depending on how you want to translate that term. And that is God himself. So this comes from a sort of lack of understanding on the part of the objector, and ultimately a sophistry. Well, that is all of the objections that I thought would be helpful from De Revelatione. If you want to, you can go through and read all of the ones that I didn't go over, or kind of read the original text of what Garrigou said and all of the ones that I did go over. So that is all. If you enjoyed this, like, subscribe. If you really enjoy it, Patreon, all of that stuff. I don't really need to mention that. So as